Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. High-definition television is something millions around the world today take for granted. Ever since the phasing out of analog and the embracement of digital, more viewers than ever before have access to HD, providing their favourite programmes with a new, sharp, clearly defined picture. But if you think about it, we've always had HD. It just depends on the way that you look at it. When television first started up back in 1936, the 405-line EMI Marconi standard was considered and often advertised as high-definition television. Looking back almost 100 years later, that claim seems laughable, but for several decades, the 405-line system was the absolute bedrock of television broadcasting here in the UK. That is, until it finally met its untimely end. When the British Broadcasting Corporation was gearing up to launch the world's first regular television service, they had some important decisions to make. There were two studios set up at London's Alexandra Palace, and equally, there were two kinds of television systems that were being tried out in the hope that one would become the defining standard. One was devised by the father of television itself, John Logie Baird. His system was mechanical in nature and would produce a 240-line picture. His competition would be from EMI Marconi, whose electronic-based system produced a 405-line picture. It was ultimately decided that both systems would get the chance to be put to use on the new BBC television service, alternating each week for 6 months, before one would be dropped out in favour of the victor. This call was ultimately made in just under 3 months, when on the 30th of January, 1957, the Baird system was used for the last time. In comparison, this seemed like the logical choice. Not only did the Marconi EMI system offer almost double the amount of lines displayed on a TV screen, but it worked much more practically in the TV studios, able to better capture light, and for the presenters or performers to wear less egregious makeup. So 405 line was now the sole standard to be used throughout the United Kingdom when it came to television broadcasting. And yes, believe it or not, this was hailed as the first regular, high-definition television service in the world. With it being a trailblazer, you'd assume that the 405-line standard would become commonplace in other nations too. In 1939, various countries experimented with 405-line based transmissions, including France, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and Switzerland. The United States opted for a 525-line system for their black and white broadcasts, although initially greenlit a 405-line system for the introduction of colour back in 1950. But despite this promising step, the CBS-developed system, which involved the use of a colour wheel, was ultimately abandoned for a variety of reasons, chief amongst them that their new colour standard wasn't backwards compatible with existing television sets. Back home in the UK, the 405-line system would remain unchallenged for nearly 3 decades. But when the BBC had been given the go-ahead to launch its second television channel at the dawn of the 60s, things were clearly going to change. 1964 saw the launch of BBC Two, which operated solely on a brand new 625-line system, utilising the then brand new ultra-high frequency, or UHF. 625 lines offered even greater definition than ever before, the next step in HD, if you will. The problem was, to experience this jump in quality, viewers would have to upgrade their television sets to dual standard models, so they could enjoy the enhanced transmissions from BBC Two while still enjoying the 405-line broadcasts from ITV and BBC One. 1967 saw the regular introduction of colour programming on BBC Two, meaning even more complex sets would be required, ones that were colour capable. It's fair to say that through the second half of the 1960s, however, 405 lines was still the dominant system through which viewers consumed their television programmes. But by November 1969, both BBC One and ITV would also make the leap towards full-time colour broadcasting. And with all programmes now entirely made using the 625 line standard, 405 line was now obsolete and consigned to the television history books. Or was it? Whilst Britain spent most of the 1970s gradually transitioning towards upgrading or purchasing colour sets, the 405 line system still serves some sort of purpose. Anyone without a 625 line receiver or colour-capable TV could still enjoy programmes offered by the BBC and ITV, except they would be entirely in monochrome. The 405 line system, that had been developed all the way back in the 1930s, hadn't been necessarily designed for colour broadcasting in mind, a concept that was still a pipe dream for the engineers back then. As such, whilst 405 line transmissions continued for those who needed them, their pictures would lack the vibrant colour that programmes now offered, and the picture quality now seemed a little lacklustre in comparison. What was once viewed as the pioneering high-definition standard was becoming merely a footnote in the then current television landscape. There was another key reason as to why 405-line television clung on for so long. Just as audiences were transitioning to acquiring colour TV sets, broadcasters were busy trying to set up new transmitters and relays that were based around the UHF 625-line service. By the beginning of the 80s, however, 625-line coverage was almost as strong as 405, meaning that the legacy system's days were growing ever more numbered. After having coexisted with its impressive successor for over 20 years, it was duly announced that all remaining 405-line transmissions would finally end in the first few days of 1985. The occasion was a sad but understandable one for the technical engineers and others within the industry. Many transmitter stations had equipment for 405-line television that had been installed back in the 1950s. On one hand, it was very impressive that they were still in good working condition, but the technological advancements in the intervening decades had long rendered them obsolete. Not to mention, maintenance costs for the old 405-line system were far more troublesome and regular than the 625-line equipment. Many of the parts needed to repair the kit couldn't even be sourced anymore. With most of the country now only consuming television via 625 lines, as many new TVs were built to receive just the UHF, 405 lines had run out of options. The time had come to bid a fond farewell to the world's first regular, high-definition television system. On the 3rd of January, 1985, 405-line television was ended for good. The occasion was marked in a few ways. During BBC One's close down, the legacy system was noted by the continuity announcer, complete with an old 1930s TV set to boot.
And it's goodbye to 405, and it's goodbye from me. For tonight, anyway.
Perhaps more in-depth was the coverage featured on IBA's engineering announcements. The programme, originally designed specifically for engineers and those in the TV trade, had been running since 1970, and by 1985 had gained a cult following from regular viewers too. The team behind the show organised a touching tribute to the 405-line system, including interviews with transmitter workers, as well as a brief history of the standard itself. After the first week of 1985 had concluded, the UHF 625-line system became the sole standard in use on UK television, thus truly becoming the definitive version of what was once seen as high definition. 405-line TV in total lasted in the UK from its earliest beginnings back in late 1936 all the way up until early 1985, a lifespan of almost 50 years. That's impressive to say the least, especially with all the technological advancements and leaps that occurred during the system's lifetime. But despite its prominent use in the UK, it was also in some other parts of the world too. Our neighbours in the Republic of Ireland had long been acquainted with the system. Before the establishment of their own television service in 1961, many viewers had either bought or imported 405-line sets to receive broadcast and transmissions from various parts of the UK, most notably Wales and Northern Ireland. In some respects, Ireland actually was ahead of the UK when it came to incorporating new standards for high-definition television. Just 1 year after Telefís Éireann launched, 1962 would see the broadcaster begin showing programmes primarily in 625 lines, 2 years behind the launch of BBC Two in the UK. 405-line transmissions would continue to be simulcast just as they were in the UK for another 20 years before finally ceasing in Ireland in 1982. Finally, let's touch on Hong Kong. They too had a 405-line system in operation, though it wasn't being provided by the BBC. Instead, Rediffusion Television, one of the first broadcasters of Hong Kong, begun the service in 1957. At the time, this made Hong Kong the first British colony and first predominantly Chinese city to have access to the medium of television. However, the 405-line standard wouldn't last as long as it did in the UK, ceasing in 1973, when Rediffusion Television swapped from being a cable subscription service to being free-to-air and adopting the 625-line PAL system for transmissions.
But first, what are the prospects for high-definition television?
Technology is always moving forward. We're always discovering and experiencing new ways in which we can utilise it to improve our lives in some way, shape or form. In television, that couldn't be more accurate. We've come a long way from the fuzzy pictures of old to what we have nowadays, but it's always important to remember that from the late 1930s until at least the mid-1960s, if you were a UK viewer, this was high-definition television. The 405-line system kick-started the medium in Britain, and without its presence and longevity, we may not have experienced the enhanced possibilities of 625 lines, or even colour broadcasting. You may be at the forefront of something for a while, but something will equally always come along to succeed you. That happened with 405-line television, but the fact that it lasted so long after it was usurped, more than 20 years, goes to show that even when the technology itself grows obsolete, the impact that's left behind is one that is viewed with affection, and one that is remembered for the advancements yet to come. Here's to 405-line television. the world's first regular high-definition service.
And I hope that you can join us for more high-definition viewing tomorrow, beginning at 6:30 with breakfast time. Good night. Well, I don't suppose your television looks quite like this, but it may well bring back memories of the days when television was in its infancy. We've dusted it off to mark a very historic moment, not only for BBC One, but for television as a whole, because once we go off the air, we wave goodbye to the 405 line transmission system, which started the first public television service. Well, it's been going strong ever since 1936, but in 1964 along came the superior 625 line system, which brought improved definition and, a few years later, of course, colour.